Deidre Bloomquist, welcome to Rebels with a Root Cause. So happy to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to share today.
So introduce yourself to the audience and who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so I am a functional nutritionist and I specialize in environmental toxins. We work with both kids who are struggling with gut and skin issues to figure out what's actually happening in their body causing that inflammation. And we do a lot of fertility and preconception detoxification as well when we're thinking about modern toxicity and how it's impacting all of us.
Wonderful. All right. Well, what's your rebel story?
So I have a little boy. His name's Jasper. And when I knew I was pregnant with him, I knew how important my health was. We give everything to our kids, and just thinking about the fact that all of our gut health gets transferred in utero to our kids. So I knew how important this was going to be. So I was healthy. I was moving my body. I was taking care of myself. I hadn't taken antibiotics in probably 10 years at that point. And I felt really good about giving him a good gut microbiome because I knew how important it was going to be for the rest of his life to set him up for health. And he was born at home. He was breastfed. And so I was really shocked when he was about 9 months old that he started developing eczema. And it started as a really small spot on his chest where I was a first-time mom. I went in and talked to his pediatrician. I saw a naturopath, just thinking, you know, is there a second opinion that I can get here to be supportive and help me figure this out so it doesn't get to a bad spot? And I went in, I saw his pediatrician, and she was integrative. And so at the time she agreed with me. This is a gut health issue. And I was like, okay, well, I don't really know how that happened, but that sounds good.
Now at the time, were you an integrative nutritionist? Like you had everything already. So it wasn't new to you, right?
Nope. But I was working with adults. I had no idea how to work with kids. I had no intention of working with kids at any point. So I followed their instructions. We put him on a probiotic. I changed my diet. I was looking for all the help I could get. And his rash started getting worse. So what started as a very small spot on his body ended up being his entire body. And it wasn't the way that we normally think about eczema, where it's in the creases of their elbows or behind their knees. It was his whole chest, and it covered his legs, and it was red and inflamed and itchy, and he was so uncomfortable. And I went back and they said, well, maybe it's an allergy. So we did a blood draw on him at 11 months old, which was horrible, mostly for me.
Wow.
And we waited anxiously for the results to come back, and it came back that he didn't have any allergies. Everything came back negative. So I got on a telehealth call with his pediatrician, and she basically said, that's the only option I have. So at this point, I need to refer you to a dermatologist, and they are probably going to give him a topical steroid. And I already knew that that's something I didn't want to do. I knew that was an immediate option for me, but I knew all of the side effects that could come with that.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the side effects because I think it's important because everybody thinks like it's topical.
Yes.
Right? It's fine. But we all understand that the skin, it's a huge sponge, right? And when those toxins get in, they're hard to get out.
Yeah, they absorb everything. So the skin is the largest organ. It is absorbing everything dermally. And ultimately what topical steroids do is they're suppressing immune function on the surface of the skin. So we have cells in the skin that are creating these inflammatory chemicals that make the skin red and inflamed and itchy. So it can suppress that, but it's not really fixing the real issue of what is the gut and the immune system so upset about in the first place. But the other thing that a lot of parents don't realize is that topical steroids are only approved for use for 1 to 2 weeks, meaning that a lot of parents are being handed this as their only option without looking deeper. So while it can be helpful from a symptom relief perspective, it's not getting to the deeper issue and what's driving that. It can also impact the entire way that the brain communicates with endocrine function, especially the adrenals for kids. So they can have dysregulated cortisol output as a result of using this, which then is going to impact things like their thyroid and their sex hormones as they grow. So I really didn't want to do that. And I was on this call with the pediatrician, and she said, you know, that's my only option for you. There's no cure for eczema, so maybe he'll grow out of it, but those are the only options I have.
So first, this is my only option. Number one, false, right?
Correct.
And there's no cure for eczema. False as well, right?
Also.
Okay, great. So we just want to call that out.
Yep. So, you know, I had been working with adults and we were doing functional testing and looking at gut microbiome markers as well as toxicity. And I said, you know, I think I might run these tests on him just to see what comes back. And I'll never forget. She looked at me and she said, there's no way he has gut pathogens. He's too little, and there's no way he's been exposed to toxins at this point in his life. So I don't think you're going to find answers. And I knew at that point that they weren't going to be helpful anymore, and it was up to me to figure this out. So I ended up running those tests on him just to see what would happen. And I, to this day, have never seen a microbiome test that looked like his. His calprotectin, which was an immune marker, was maxed out on the test. So he would have been diagnosed with something like IBD.
And what is IBD?
IBD would be inflammatory bowel disease.
Okay.
So he would have been diagnosed with this and been told, this is something you're going to live with for the rest of your life as well. Here's a medication to internally decrease inflammation. But again, we're not going to dig any deeper of why that's happening.
Yeah.
His whole gut was overgrown when it comes to these harmful and inflammatory bacteria. He had parasitic overgrowths. And then I started asking, how did this happen? Because I don't have any symptoms of this. And I actually ran stool testing on myself as well to look at my gut health, and I didn't have any of those markers. So then I was very confused. The other thing that I did was I started looking at toxins. And so I looked at mold mycotoxins and heavy metals and chemicals. And that's where I started to figure out the similarities between us. What I didn't realize is that all of the toxins that I had been exposed to for the entire duration of my life were also given to him, and he inherited on day one. And that's really what drove all of his gut issues as a smaller body, because I was fine and able to handle that, but he wasn't. So it made a huge difference in what we did. Ultimately, I put him on a protocol where we were looking at diet, lifestyle. I did some key supplementation to help him detox. His eczema went away in a month, and it has never come back. He can tolerate all the foods that he didn't used to be able to tolerate. He is a normal, healthy kid. And if we wouldn't have gotten ahead of it right then and there, it could be something that he would still be struggling with today.
Yeah. So, this reminds me of when my daughter was young, and I was working in the corporate world back then. And I remember leaving for a trip, and I had my suit on, but I'd take my suit off, and I had my dress shirt, and I had to put a towel because I'd have to burp her, and she was lactose intolerant, right? And I remember just, it was just projectile, like all the time. And I never understood why that was, right? Because now what you're talking about is like, oh, maybe it was something that was transferred to her, because I never had these issues to my recollection, nor did my wife at the time. So this is probably more common, and it shows up in different ways.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the most confusing part is, when we work with families now, it's not uncommon that we will see children and babies have very similar symptom presentations as mom. That's a very easy thing for us to understand. But what we're finding more and more is there are very healthy couples and women who are having children who now have these health issues, and they feel like, I thought I prevented this, just like I did. And so having a conversation about why that's happening, not only from what children are being exposed to in the short duration of their life, but also what their mom was exposed to and how that influences their immune system from the time that they are in utero to when they are earthside and being exposed to more. If we start day one of life with a toxin bucket that is already very full, it means that we have very limited capacity for anything that we do come in contact with. And we often forget that children are these tiny bodies. So their bodies become toxic so much faster. They are so much sensitive, not because they are inherently sensitive and don't have the resiliency that we do as adults, but they ultimately just get impacted first. They're kind of the canaries in the coal mines for many families.
Yeah. So talk about your history, because you said you were working with adults. Now, did you start as a functional nutritionist? Was that kind of the start for you? Was there any nutrition training prior to this? Like, how did you get into this field?
Yeah, so I actually started as a CrossFit trainer and a personal trainer, and I love nutrition. I've always been obsessed with human physiology and the way the body works. And one of the things that I really realized is that people were moving their bodies and thinking about what they were doing in the gym, but they weren't really aware of their internal terrain and what was happening from a hormone perspective and a gut perspective and how that influenced the results that they had. So I actually started looking more into the functional side of things and how we could analyze what's happening in their body from a testing perspective to actually give us data, especially when people don't have a ton of symptoms. There's so many people who we see who are really working on, I have these gut symptoms and I want to get resolution on that. But a lot of people start to have things pop up that are a surprise. So, one of the things that I realized even through my son's journey is had I have known about all those toxins that I had, even being totally healthy and asymptomatic, if I could go back, I would have done some work around that and detoxed myself prior to conceiving. And for many of the women in particular that we work with, the inability to get pregnant or the incidence of miscarriages are the first warning sign that there's anything happening in their body in the first place. Or they are randomly diagnosed with an autoimmune condition, even though they feel fine, they move their body fine, and they take care of themselves. So I think there's these things that we're starting to see come up more and more in modern society that are indicating that there's something wrong, but we don't necessarily have the tools for assessing why those things are happening.
Interesting. So so it was your son then was the trigger to start to work with children, right? So because there was a deep passion, right? Did you have other moms start to come to you and like, tell us that journey?
Yes. So I never intended on working with kids. I was very scared of working with my son because I had no idea, how do you even do something like this? It's very easy with adults. These are the diet changes. This is how you change your lifestyle. If I'm having you take supplements.
Easy with adults. Yeah, come on.
Easier in many capacities.
At least the kids are like, yeah, okay, whatever you say, Mom. I'm like, okay, gosh.
Totally. They can swallow capsules. Right. Kids can't do that.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't really have, especially, he was 1 year old at the time. He didn't know I was giving him these things that tasted bad.
Yeah.
So I had no idea what I was doing. But as I started sharing the story and I said, looking back in retrospect, this is how I fixed my son's eczema. And I did it very quickly. I started having moms be like, oh my gosh, my kids have these issues too. Can you help? And so I started working with more and more kids. And I realized that we could get rid of these conditions for kids very quickly, within a matter of months, for kids who had been struggling for years in many cases. So I started building my pediatric team, and I started with one practitioner who was seeing kids. And then I quickly realized, wow, she's at capacity. We have to keep hiring and hiring. So right now we have a team of 5 practitioners who see kids virtually all across the country. Wow. And what's ended up happening is we really specialize in gut health and eczema, and we have a 95% success rate for getting kids fully clear, which is drastically different than what we think about when it comes to these kids only being given topical steroids, or if they're only looking at gut health. And the key driver that's really different in what we do is assessing what's happening from a toxin burden perspective. Now, some of these kids are living in mold, so that's an entirely different thing. Mold is a lot more common than a lot of families realize, especially depending on where they live in the country. But a lot of these kids are also inheriting these things from their parents as well. So we do see a lot of kids, for instance, who are what their parents call miracle babies. They were born via IVF, or they had recurrent miscarriages. And this is their child who they're so incredibly grateful to have, but now they're sick and wondering why that happened as well.
Wow. So talk about the journey of many of your clients, or not your patients, because of course your patients are the children, but the parents. And what are some of the challenges they come to you talking about these traditional doctors in the system that are basically telling them the same thing they told you? The eczema, you can't solve this, and the only thing you can do is topical steroids.
So a lot of them have been struggling for a very long period of time. A blessing in some ways when we see kids come in when they are about 6 months old and they haven't been struggling for very long, but not uncommon that we'll have kids come in who are 3 or 4 years old and they have been struggling with eczema since they were born and trying to find answers. These parents have tried everything. They've seen their pediatrician. Oftentimes they have seen other more integrative providers and run out of options for why is this actually happening? So they might be part of the way there in terms of what's actually happening in their body, but oftentimes they have gone through and tried topical steroids. Sometimes they work temporarily, but as soon as they stop using them, it comes right back. We're seeing more and more kids who are using biologics as well, where we're actually suppressing the immune system with an injection. And that, again, might be help sometimes, but it doesn't always. So many of the kids that we see have tried topical steroids. They've tried biologics, and their kids are still uncomfortable and itchy. They can't sleep at night, which when you have little kids, if they don't sleep, nobody's sleeping. So parents are exhausted. Yeah. They feel like they are failing their kids, which is exactly how I felt too, especially since I worked in this space as well. I knew so much and felt like I should be able to fix this. Why is it taking me so long? So they just really feel like they've run out of options, and they're starting to wonder if this is always going to be the case. And the other thing is when we know what's happening from a skin perspective is we're really thinking about the immune system. And so parents start to think about, what else is this going to mean? Is my kid always going to be sick? And not just from a skin perspective. Are they going to get every little thing? Can we go out in public? We have a lot of parents who stop taking their kids to places like the grocery store even because they're worried about, one, are they going to get sick? And two, they start to have strangers commenting on their kids' skin and asking, do they have a sunburn? Do they have rosacea? You know, they make medicine for that to help them. And so what we find is that a lot of parents just stop going out in public because they feel like they can't without judgment from society as a whole. They can't take their kids to go to the playground and play and be normal kids. And so one of the big things that we're always thinking about with our families is not only helping these kids get healthy, but really giving them their childhood back. And in many cases, giving parents their parenthood back, because many of them are first-time parents. And this is all that they have ever known, is how hard this really can be when you have a child with a chronic condition.
Yeah. So what about the older kids, you know, the 10-year-olds, the 14-year-olds, 16-year-olds that have been living with this their entire lives? Like, what's their, you know, how do they work through this?
Yeah, absolutely. It is very similar. And in many cases, it can be easier because I think when we're working with older children, they have more agency around the situation and they understand how uncomfortable this is. It can be easier and challenging in some ways with older kids because they are more strong-willed and they can choose to do things or not do things. But oftentimes we're integrating them into care to have a conversation with them so they understand why we're asking them to make these changes. When we're working with younger children, parents are facilitating everything. It's like, here's your supplements, here's what we're doing. They make all of those changes for them. But with older kids, we're often having a conversation around diet changes. How can we really help support nutrient replenishment and gut healing through the dietary changes that you're making? And then having a conversation about, is this a long-term solution or is this a short-term change that we're making with the goal of these things coming back into your life at some point in time? So I think that is really helpful. And we love working with preteens because oftentimes they are motivated. They've been struggling with this too for so long. And there's things that I think often come out of those conversations with kids that parents don't even know about. There's symptoms that they're experiencing when we start to really dive in and get to know them, not only from a lab perspective and a data perspective, but who they are as a person and their experience so that we can have a full comprehensive look at everything and making sure that they have a roadmap going forward, which then leads them into young adulthood to be more resilient when we're thinking about them going through puberty and all of the sex hormones that come with it and making sure that everything is in a good spot. So, you know, one of the things I'm always thinking about is with kids, and we know that there is this huge toxin burden that we're all being exposed to. There's a huge infertility epidemic that's happening. I want to make sure that my little boy, when he grows up, if he wants to have kids, he's able to do that. And that starts when they're very little.
Let's talk about the gut, because you made mention of that. So what type of gut issues are you seeing? Leaky gut? And you're seeing, like, because we know how toxic that is, right? Like the gut becomes permeable and then all the toxins are getting into the body. And I'm sure that's what's causing a lot of these issues. So how about that?
Yep, absolutely. We see a lot of leaky gut. So we're thinking about intestinal permeability. We also see a lot of overgrowth of different pathogens. So we see a lot of kids with very significant bacterial issues. And the way that I think about gut health is that it's ultimately a byproduct of what's happening from a toxin perspective. So our bodies are so smart, they're intended to take care of us. Yeah. And as a result, they will adapt to what we are being exposed to. So with bacteria, for instance, I'm always thinking about if I see a bacterial overgrowth that's causing not only gut issues, but then leading to things like skin infections or recurrent strep throat or recurrent ear infections. Why is that happening? And the bacteria are really there to be breaking down tissue. So what is hurting the tissue and damaging it in the first place? But we very commonly see a lot of fungal overgrowths in the gut. Candida and fungus is a very normal part of our microbiome. But when it starts to overgrow, that's where it starts to cause a lot of this tissue damage. And so then we're asking, is this a mold issue? A lot of people don't realize that Candida even actually metabolizes and therefore breaks down things like heavy metals and radioactive substances. So if we have that in our terrain and in our bodies.
Radioactive substances.
Yes.
Where are those coming from?
Great question. A lot of people don't know about radioactive substances or ever talk about this. So when I say radioactive substances, I'm thinking about things like radium and uranium. A lot of times these are coming from water sources. So I'm thinking about tap water, Most people don't realize that much of the U.S. water is actually contaminated with these. So for instance, 70% of Texas tap water is contaminated with radium, and people don't realize that they're being exposed to this. There's huge pockets. So we're really thinking not only about tap water, but in a lot of parts of the country, because of drilling for oil, what happens is we drill into the Earth's surface where radium and uranium naturally reside, but we're also bringing it to the surface. And a lot of these companies are actually taking these byproducts that are very toxic and then finding new sources for them. So they are actually taking these, and for a long time they were being put as de-icer that was being sprayed on roadways that people were being exposed to. It's being put on pasture land in a lot of the Midwest. So we're being exposed to these things in a number of different ways. And we see a lot of people actually who live in California and on the West Coast being exposed to uranium that came over the ocean from World War II due to bombings.
What?
So we see that impacting not only water sourcing, but then we have to be thinking about all of the crops that are being grown in California that are then absorbing those things, the animals that we are then consuming that are toxic as a result. So we're thinking about those things, and nobody is really talking about that. Ultimately, it means that we're driving heavy metals into bones, because a lot of radioactive substances are ultimately bone seeking, which is why when you hear about radium and uranium, you're usually hearing about like bone cancer, for instance. That's because they actually they're bone seeking, and then they drive metals to be sequestered within bones for safety mechanisms. But that obviously has unintended consequences when we think about bone marrow. So those things are things our kids are being exposed to a lot. We don't have a ton of detoxification capacity for those types of substances, which means that it's going to be driving these big fungal issues in kids. So fungal issues is the number one thing that we're seeing with a lot of kids with eczema. And it's not always mold. Sometimes it is, but oftentimes they have heavy metal issues that are driving that fungal issue. And it just is something that we're not even screening them for.
Wow. All right. So I had no idea this was going this way, but I'm like blown away by this. Like, I knew it was toxic, but I didn't know that it was that toxic. And when you brought up radioactive substances, I'm like, uh-oh, we've got some real problems. So this is the question, like, how do we as a population, really get ourselves and our children, of course, right? Because this is so important. Doesn't matter how old they are, right? To basically get them, to build them resilient, right? To get them moving forward so that they can have a normal life, have children and things like that, and have functioning bodies. So knowing that the system is in many cases, like they're not doing what they're doing. They're treating the symptom, right? With the creams and saying you can't do this, you can't do that. But when you get to the root cause, you start to see what's challenging these situations. So how do we get this like to become more mainstream?
Yeah, I feel like toxin testing should be standard of care anytime something big comes up. It's a very simple and non-invasive test. We can do this via urine testing. So it doesn't even have to be a blood draw on kids. So all of the kids that we work with do toxin testing. All of the adults we work with are doing toxin testing so that we can rule things out if needed. The other big thing that I'm always thinking about is we are all exposed to toxins, even when we are making the best choices in our personal lives and the things we're consuming and being exposed to. There's things in the air, it's in the water, we travel, like there's so many things. It's impossible.
You can't avoid it.
It's impossible.
And you can't live in a sauna your entire life, right?
Absolutely. And you can't live in fear of these things because it exists and it is likely going to get worse. So what I'm always thinking about is how do we create lifestyles that support detoxification and have that be the norm? So thinking about things like, how do we sauna? How do we get kids moving? Even just having kids move their body is moving their lymph, which is an important part of their immune system. And that really goes back to, especially kids in school. We're taking away things like recess and not having them move their body. Having kids be hydrated properly. And it's not just water. We're thinking about clean quality water, but then also reintroducing things like electrolytes and minerals so that they are cellularly hydrated to support detox. Even thinking about things like reducing exposure. So I'm always thinking about three main pillars. One is always going to be air quality. The air that kids are breathing at home can be incredibly toxic indoors compared to outdoors, even in polluted areas. But then also thinking about the air in their schools, the air that they're breathing, and getting them outside for fresh air is a huge one. I'm thinking about water quality in particular, because that's going to reduce toxins in a huge way. not only from a metal and a radioactive perspective, but then also thinking about pesticides. A lot of people don't realize that there are a lot of medications that are in tap water, things like NSAIDs, birth control, Plan B, all of those are in tap water, and we're giving that to our kids. So it makes
is
a
that
big
because
problem.
they're being disposed into? Okay, got it.
Yep. So a lot of people
they can't filter those things out, right?
They can't. And we often don't realize that when we're thinking about tap water, it is ultimately sewage water that is being purified and cleaned, and then we drink it, but it's not removing everything.
Mm-hmm.
And then my third one is always food quality. So thinking about if we can eat organic foods as much as possible, which I know is so difficult, especially in our current economy for families, especially with larger families. But thinking about reducing pesticide and herbicide exposure is really huge. And then that quality also then coincides with those things are going to be grown in areas where they are not absorbing everything out of soil. So not even thinking about nutrients, soil depletion, anything, reducing those three kind of areas ultimately means that we're decreasing the toxins that are being given to our kids. And it really can be that simple to start.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, Deidre Bloomquist, thank you so much for your time. How can the audience find you in your business, to maybe help them as they may be practitioners that are in the field that you're in, or even parents that are listening as well?
Yeah. Our website is always-growing, and our pediatric page is actually always growing _littles on Instagram. You can find us. We have a lot of education there, and I'm always happy to help anybody.
Great. And always.growing or -growing.com?
Yes.
Correct?
.com.
Okay, wonderful.